So sort of an indirect indication. China was perhaps one of the more critical countries in terms of the US debt downgrade and the US fiscal policy. Are they perhaps being a little bit less active in terms of their foreign exchange intervention? Are they perhaps being a little bit less, volume purchases of US treasuries, and is that allowing the currency to go just a little bit higher, a little bit quicker? So, I mean, I think that's an interesting question to consider as well.
Okay, thanks for your time today. Nick, we'll see you again next week, if not before then. Nick Brennan Brook, Wells Fargo. More with Kel from UBS in just a second or two. Rikuzen Takata, a seaside town in the northeast of Japan in Iwata Prefecture, was one of the hardest hit communities after the March 11 Fukushima tragedy. More than 1,700 died or still missing. Nearly 8% of the population. As our bureau chief out of Tokyo, Kaori, reports, survivors say that political gridlock in Tokyo is starving them of money that they vastly need to rebuild.
Stories of devastation are retold every day along the northeastern coast of Japan, each as tragic now as they were 5 months ago. A family business swallowed, 204 years of tradition lost in an instant. A proud soy sauce merchant, his son and 3 grandchildren were the envy of town. Now this may be all that is left of that business. But the son, Michihiro Kono, is determined to rise again.
If we keep getting handouts, I'm afraid that we will forget how we planted seeds, watered the crops and toiled the land. We need to think quickly about getting back on our feet.
With no crops, culture or vats, Kono relies on other manufacturers to produce. It's a money loser, but he's kept all 37 employees. The only way, he says, to preserve the brand and the dignity of his workers. Kono shuttles to Tokyo to implore companies to do business in Rikuzen Takata. 4,000 households in his hometown were destroyed by the tsunami and need jobs. If he can get one major corporation to come, he thinks others will quickly follow. This is what's left of the business community, and the land is literally sinking into the ocean. Kono's enthusiasm is still searching for a place to resonate, but he knows he needs to do so quickly before the young leave town for good. For guidance counselors at this high school, the immediate challenge is so daunting that teachers will only talk about the very distant future.
The city was financially strapped long before the disaster. We want the students to find their own calling. Some of them may return to Rikuzen Takata to become pillars of the community as it rebuilds. That is our dream.
Rebuilding has not even started. It may take another 2 months before SME Japan, a governmental agency, starts building the temporary stores it pledged in April to help small business owners.
Business owners cannot apply for unemployment insurance. For 6 months, they had nothing. We're desperate for a roof over our heads while bureaucracy wants to follow the rules.
That's not how Kono sees this landscape. If the earth is too filthy to ever farm again, he wants to turn the crop into biofuel to power the town. With a laugh, he says fermenting plant sugars into bioethanol is like turning soy into soy sauce. He knows it's a dream, but one that would save his business and maybe even his city. Kaori Enjoji, CNBC, Iwate, Japan.
On this landmark moment, obviously, after the fact, Naomi Fink, Japan strategist Jeffries, joins us from Tokyo. Kelvin from UBS is still with us, guest hosting out of the SGX. Naomi, good morning to you. You know, it's been months after the fact. Far from getting better, it looks like the situation continues to muddle along. I mean, there is political gridlock. You have an incumbent prime minister who is probably on his last legs, and a region which really hasn't gotten the help that they need. What are we to make of this?
Well, first of all, we still do have a pipeline of reconstruction funds that are likely to be dispatched in Japan. And then on the political side, we probably have actually come a little bit closer to cooperation between LDP and DPJ, because they have had to agree on the necessary measures that were contingent upon that Khan has specified were necessary for his departure, and that was the second extraordinary budget of 2 trillion yen. That's done. Also approved was the deficit financing bill, and now we have today the new energy bill that's up for consideration. That required some compromise between two parties, and if Khan leaves on this note, then we're a little bit closer, not further away, to a grand coalition that would be one pathway to escape from political gridlock.
Naomi, when we talk about Japan globally, we know a lot of fortunes are resting on Japan recovering from this disaster. If you talk about the US in particular, we saw the growth numbers affected by what happened there with the earthquake and tsunami. Do you think there is any sense that Japan is going to be back up and running to an extent where it will help out the global economy in the second half of this year?
Well, firstly, the supply chains have recovered a lot more quickly than many had expected. The time frame right after the quake for recovery was put somewhere around October, whereas a lot of the supply chains are perhaps not fully back up and running, but they're, for all intents and purposes, almost recovered. So I think this time is relatively crucial for Japan because it's the peak energy consumption season because of the heat. So if it gets through this, then it's going to be a lot smoother sailing than initially assumed before the summer. So if we look at some of the data out recently in Japan, we've actually seen some very tangible signals of improvement in sentiment, corporate sentiment, and consumer sentiment in the Economy Watcher survey. So I think that the recovery is occurring in Japan. It's occurring faster than expected. Right. The supply chain disruptions are getting resolved, which also have a positive impact elsewhere. Whether it's going to be the engine of growth globally, well, that's it's a little bit of a stretch to say that, but it is recovering.
Naomi, my eyes were drawn, my attention was drawn to an ad placement, 2/3 of an entire page in local press by the government of Japan, with a scattering of tourists, talking about how wonderful it is to be in Japan and how much they're enjoying Japan again 5 months on. Of late, you talk about supply chain disruptions and resolution coming. The food supply chain is once again very suspect. News flow in recent weeks has talked about how radioactive beef had entered various parts of the food chain. Do you think that this element might cause irreparable damage to the agricultural space?
Well, it's hard at this stage to forecast whether something's going to cause irreparable damage or not. But one thing that I would point out is that the DPJ's policy on FTAs is now being tied strongly to agricultural reform. Perhaps now that we have a problem in agriculture as well, then it's time to look at reforming the whole sector and trying to handle this with a more forward-looking, outward-looking view, which might help Japan overcome this hurdle.
Naomi, just really quickly, one of the unintended consequences of the triple disaster was this counterintuitive spike in yen levels. We seem to be back almost to the same paradigm now. Can enough be done by the authorities to cool the appreciation in the Japanese currency?
Well, the one thing about the yen's strength now is that it's very different from yen's strength, for instance, in the 90s, because Japan produces a lot more abroad than it did then. So it's a bit buffered against that yen strength. Plus, if you look at the yen on a real effective basis, very different than the nominal basis, deflation has helped Japan stay competitive. So I think that's why the authorities are a little bit less alarmed about the yen's levels alone, but what they are looking at is how it affects corporate sentiment, because, of course, exporters still do prefer the yen to be weaker rather than stronger. Also, they're looking at the yen as a kind of signal for risk aversion. And since we have seen the flows into the yen, we've also seen some volatility in risk assets and some relatively precipitous drops in stocks. So I think they're looking at the yen in the context of the risk assets and what's necessary to reflate those risk assets, especially stocks.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much for joining us today, Naomi Fink. With us, we're going to have plenty more to come with Kelvin Tay of UBS in just a moment. Well, the CME is raising its margins for COMEX gold futures. Will that help rein in prices? Well, it's doing little right now. In fact, gold prices have hit fresh all-time records early Asia's side. Can the price keep on climbing?